Hello and welcome to Of Significance, the podcast about what's relevant, what's important, and what's meaningful. It's where we address whether the numbers and analytics we see daily are incredibly useful or nearly insignificant. I'm your every person host, Brent Buckwright, here with Dr. Nathan Woods and Dr. Steve Broners, experienced experts who have been analyzing big data since before it's big. Nathan, Steve, what's on Tapital for today? Are we talking human capital in any way? I know my rhymes might be yapping, but I'm unflappable in what I say. What do we got?
Oh, boy. Well, Brent, you had told us somewhere along the way that nothing attracts listeners like the words theory and practical application. Apparently rhymes as well today. We thought we'd combine those things and dive into the concept of human capital theory. What, if any, application it might have as a practical matter to analysis of a company's employment data?
That's right. The human capital theory has like lots of different important applications. We're going to just focus on this one thing, which is the similarities and sometimes not so similarities between human capital models and then what we do when we analyze the internal pay policies inside a firm, inside a business.
Right. So the idea is, and if I recall my Econ 101, which I definitely took and passed, so I got a job here. It basically says like investments in your education or any kind of training will result in increased productivity for a worker. So like if I increase my own human capital, I'm going to be more productive in the workplace. I'm going to get paid more. Is that the general idea? Is there any other bells and whistles on that?
Yeah, that's a general idea. I think it's a pretty good summary. It goes back to the work done by economists like Ted Schultz, Gary Becker, and then really the empirical work of a guy named Jacob Mincer at Columbia, who was very influential in the early studies. And the idea really here is that on the supply side, if I'm going to invest in an education or on-the-job training, I can't be making as much money. And so I'm going to look to get paid more after I make that investment. Otherwise, it's not worth it for me to go ahead and devote the time to that. And on the demand side, I'm only willing to pay you more if that investment actually is productive. So that's how kind of the two sides of the market come together. And so what it really means is that if I'm engaged in something like training on the job, I would expect to see my earnings grow and over time. And a key thing here is that a lot of human capital is quite general. So the worker has to pay for the human capital. And they do that by taking lower wages, because when you're learning on the job, you're distracting your coworkers, you're distracting your supervisor, and output isn't as high as it would be if you already knew what you were doing. And so you are financing the human capital acquisition by just taking lower pay. And the other thing that the theory tells us is that you're going to do more of those investments early on in your career because you can only use your own human capital. You can't leave it to someone else. And so the older you get, like somebody like me, I'm just not learning nearly
any
as
human
much.
capital.
I'm just like using what I have
Yeah.
and trying to capitalize
until we
on what you've learned.
Live in a sci-fi world where you can invest your human capital in another person.
That would change the whole thing. But the idea is, in many ways, but the idea is that because of that, and because I'm spending less of my time learning and more cashing in, as I get older, you have this increase in your earnings potential at a decreasing rate. So we expect to be a particular shape of people's career profiles where they're gaining the most in their earnings potential early on in their careers, and then it kind of flattens out over time. And it all follows from this theory that we're not going to talk about any more than this summary that we've had, but that's kind of what's behind the human capital story.
So how do they measure the human capital in that fancy academic literature?
Yeah. What are those Ivy Tower academic elites do to measure this?
Well, like in theory, it can be very complicated because you could have skills in many different dimensions and not just a single type of productivity, but productivity in different types of activities. But at the end of the day, when you start going out and applying it to the data, it's really interesting because the academics have the data that they rely on is publicly available data, generally speaking, and historically that's definitely been true. And so you don't know that much. You know someone's educational attainment and their age, how long they've been out of school. And so, all you really know from these studies is that more educated people earn more and older people earn more, which you don't really need a PhD in economics to figure that one out. But that's kind of the basic testing of the model, and it lines up with the theory. But one of the limitations really is the quality of the data that most academic studies are based on. It's based on pretty general information about people's characteristics.
So is this the problem, or that joke about the economist who's searching for his keys, under the light, but that's the only place where they can look at the data? Aren't there, how could they be making better use of this data anyway? Or is there any other measure that we've got for actual human capital?
Sure. And I think this is really where you depart from kind of the classic academic literature that Steve's talking about, and you get into more of the applied work that we and other consultants do in this field. Because we would say, to some degree, there are good measures available in any company's human resource data that tracks employees as they get hired into certain jobs and certain levels of responsibility and progress, change departments, change jobs, get promoted into greater and greater levels of responsibility. All of those fields of data, to some degree, I would say, are going to be proxying for what somebody's human capital is at any moment when they're in their kind of tenure with the company, and in a way that is probably an improvement over simply knowing that they went to school for undergrad or for graduate school or had a BS or a BA or a particular degree.
Yeah, and I think that the questions that the academics are trying to answer are a little bit different. Like, what is the value of getting a college degree, or what's the value of getting a graduate degree? Or, how much does your pay grow as you gain an experience? And so they're really looking for empirical models that cut across different jobs, different careers even, because it would be kind of silly to say you're going to go out and get a more advanced degree, but you're going to come back and work in the same company in exactly the same job. So there are tremendous advantages of the data that we have, but we're looking at people that are in the same company. And that's quite different than what the point of these human capital models are, even though if you just looked at the models that are being used, the kind of the regression models and just the look and feel of those models, they look kind of similar, but they're really trying to figure out different questions.
And just quickly, to be clear, there's a couple things. One, not all data sets at these companies are perfect. So even people that do share the same job or the same department, they may not be doing, in fact, the same job because the data is not perfect in that regard. And then, of course, we almost never have really good measures for who might be doing the job better. So even within people that are, sharing these characteristics, you might still see variety in terms of the productivity and the outcomes that they're experiencing.
So when it comes to human capital theory in an academic sense, there's the limitation of your data. You don't have all this micro stuff, but maybe it's not as relevant to even include all of that if you were going to be looking at people across jobs and across different kinds of companies. But for our purposes, doing a practical application do we just throw out the human capital theory? Is it already a part of what we do? What's the relationship between our work and what the academics already have out there?
Yeah, I think that, that human capital theory is the foundation of what we're doing. One of the limitations that we have is that we're just looking at the personnel in one company and we're not looking across the whole market, but it's definitely based on that foundation. And what's true in both is that there's tremendous heterogeneity across individuals in terms of their ability, in terms of how hard they're going to be working, and a bunch of things that, whether it's the work that we do as consultants or the work that academics do, we don't really measure that. And so I think both sides, the academic side, the studying this, and on the consulting side, there are a bunch of things that you can't really measure that are definitely going to be important in someone's success on the job.
One of the things that Steve points out in the past when we've talked about this is that a disadvantage really looking within a firm is that the higher up you go in that firm, the less and less data you've got to compare. You're going to run into jobs that have, one or maybe just a couple of people in them. And academics don't face that constraint because they can just compare everybody across the entire economy. And that's a real challenge because they're not very much comparable. And you want to think about maybe comparing outside to other companies, perhaps. That gets us a little bit away from pay equity, within a firm, the way we typically think about it. And it's more of almost like a market benchmark for how well particular jobs are paid. But it is a challenge that within the firm you don't see when you're working on the academic stuff and the broader data sets.
It definitely is. And one of the things that we're trying to do when we do these internal pay studies is find the individuals who are most comparable in terms of their length of time in the position, length of time with the company, what their overall experience is, to see what are the pay differences after we find the best comparators that we can. And as Nathan's saying, like for some jobs in some companies, there are lots of people you can compare to that are pretty similar. They've been in a job about the same amount of time. They came in with similar amounts of external experience. But as you move up the hierarchy, there are fewer and fewer positions that really are directly comparable. And so you have to try to come up with other ways of figuring out how to evaluate that person's pay relative to some benchmark. And it may need to be some external benchmark.
One thing I'm getting out of this is that the way we've talked about different kinds of jobs, that you could basically proxy for a person's human capital with like their time in their job, their time at the company overall, the actual department that they're in, maybe some level or pay grade characteristics. One thing that hasn't come up as much, though, is education. Are you guys ready to commit now to never controlling for education in your models? Are you ready to disrupt the industry? Is it super relevant? How do we weight that relative to the other factors if those can tell you more about a person's capital?
Yeah, I'll take that first. I mean, no, I don't think we're trying to disrupt the industry today, but stay tuned. Maybe on some subsequent episode. Well, first of all, we would explore anything. And so when somebody gives us a data set and asks us to assess pay equity at their firm, we're open-minded and we're looking for things that predict pay and explain pay at the company that are consistent with the company's pay philosophy. And we're building the best model we can to achieve that goal and then find out whether there are pay differences that need to be, at least investigated and potentially addressed. So we would be exploring whether or not education had those kinds of effects or not. And many times education does end up in the model in some way, shape, or form. But I would just say, Steve mentioned this earlier, the folks that share these characteristics, that are the same kind of level of responsibility at a firm, doing the same kind of work at a company, it's very unlikely that the degree that somebody has or the years of experience is going to add very much to our ability to explain that difference. And one of my favorite anecdotes in this regard is years ago working with a financial services organization, and there was somebody that was popping out of the model as being relatively better paid. That person had an art history degree, which is not a degree that we commonly associate with success in financial services. And so when we're kicking that around, we're thinking, well, how in the world is that person paid so well? Well, it's probably not because of something they learned unique to their art history undergraduate degree, but it probably had something to do with the fact that they were really good at making that firm or its clients a lot of money in a way that isn't really actually tracked in the human resource data. So we don't really know. But that's a good example where when we looked at education, it popped out in this counterintuitive way where the surprising degree was actually earning a lot more than his comparators who were otherwise working in, kind of traditional STEM related fields.
And I would just have a couple of things to add to that. One is, as a general rule in the econometrics, the statistics, it's much worse. It's much more potentially problematic to leave factors out of a model if you think they would have some explanatory power, because you might be conflating the effect of the variable you care about, which could be race, ethnicity, gender, with the thing that you left out of the model. And if you include extraneous factors that don't really have an impact on pay, it doesn't really bias the results. So it's kind of asymmetric in that way. Leaving stuff out is way more costly if it belongs in the model than putting something in that maybe doesn't need to be in there. So always err on the side of throwing more stuff in.
Regression models follow the Boy Scout rule of it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.
That is 100% true.
And by the way, don't give anything else away on that, because I'm sure that's going to be a subsequent episode.
The big takeaway I've got here, I think, is that I should have gotten an art major and gone into finance.
Well, I think that there was one other thing that you had mentioned, Brent, that I wanted to comment on, and that is really the position that you're in, whether it's described by your title, your job, family, however the particular company uses it. That's a pretty good indicator of how much human capital you have. And while you think of, spending more time in the position, it gets you, more experience, you'd be more productive. It is also the thing that gets you promoted into the next level. And one of the things that you don't really see, we don't see job tenure or length of time in a position that much in the generally available data sets that academics use. You don't see that many human capital studies of promotions, because that requires such kind of detailed information specific to a company. And so I think this is all part of this pay determination process is, what level you're at, how are you moving up through the system, and are you moving up through the system? And I mean, that's a pretty good indicator of the amount of human capital you have is where you're at. And so what we're trying to explain in these pay models is variations around that.
Well, okay. We're out of time, which means, Steve, you have something else to add?
I do.
You sly minx.
I do have something else to add here. And I mean, I want to make sure that we're respecting the human capital theory. I think it teaches us a lot. I think what it teaches me is that the reason generally why people have low rates of pay, low wages, is they're lacking the human capital. And so if we want to fix that problem, if we view that as a problem, we need to address education, on-the-job training, so that workers can have the kind of skills that employers are willing to pay for, because they're willing to pay for it if you have those skills. And if there's not the skills that they're looking for, they're just not willing to pay for that. So I think that's a really important lesson from this. And so I think it just means focus on what the root cause of the problem is rather than the symptom. The low wages are a symptom of the problem. And it's really caused by this human capital shortage, human capital deficiency, human capital shortfall that some people are in a situation because of the education and lack of on-the-job training.
Well, that's been this episode of Significance. This episode's been brought to you by Edgeworth Economics, a leader in economic consulting, and with the help of our producers, Kimberly Krewald, Ryan Deal, and Brian McLamara of Brand Ready Media, with music by Armwell Lang. Thanks for listening, StatPack, and always remember to check your assumptions.